People pretend the spiritual side of this does not exist. They will talk about sex, money, dating, trauma, even energy, as long as it stays psychological. The moment you say there is a traffic in life force, that intensity can feed something that is not you, the room goes quiet. That silence is useful to whatever lives on the leak. This is not a video about streaks. It is not a lecture on sexual bookkeeping. It is about a darker and older problem. Why so much of modern life feels like a drain, why detached sex feels like degeneration, why marriage can be real alchemy, and why the culture looks like a farm that also happens to be a school. Tom Montalk's work has been central for a lot of people who sensed this their whole lives and did not have language. He did not invent the idea, he organized it. Robert Monroe in Far Journeys reported a teaching story. Somewhere, someone needed a rare substance produced by living beings under intensity. He called it loosh. A garden was built. Conflict raised the yield. Later refinements included splitting the crop into halves so they would search for each other. Loneliness as a production method. Collectors. Channels. A harvest list that was not only war and death. It included love, friendship, family, greed, hate, guilt, religion, ownership, and sex. Anything that makes a human emit strongly. Monroe is two-sided, and that matters. The internet flattened loosh into fear juice. In the original account, the highest distillate is closer to love, sacrifice, and unfulfillment, held at a pitch above mere sensation. So the farm reading and the school reading sit on the same page. Intensity can be food for someone else or the pressure that grows a soul. The system, if you take the darker reading, prefers the cheap version, high output, low integration, repeatable. Montalk takes that term and puts it inside a predatory ecology. On montalk.net, the matrix is, among other things, machinery that arranges melodramas so humans leak emotional energy. He distinguishes orders of being. There is source. There are incarnate souls with a vertical link. And there are second-order beings, thought forms, larvae, demons, hungry discarnates, that do not have that link and therefore must eat. That one distinction saves you from a lot of cartoon cosmology. You do not need a reptilian conspiracy theory to understand this. You do not need lizards in tunnels, shape-shifting politicians, or a complete map of bloodlines. Those stories may not be entirely true. They sometimes make it easy for people to dismiss the whole subject. Montauk's framing is colder and more useful. Some beings create from a living connection to God, some cannot. What cannot create must siphon. What siphons prefers you fragmented, ashamed, aroused, angry, lonely, and coming back. Negative loosh, in his language, is false emotion generated from illusion. That is their cuisine. Not only lust, anger that goes nowhere, jealousy that rehearses the same scene until dawn, anxiety that never becomes courage, depression that flattens the will so nothing is offered upward, despair, contempt, the signature of a feeling that did not rise toward truth. Positive, God-rooted feeling is harder for them to metabolize. It tends to starve them. Loosh is not only food, it is fuel. It lets a low-frequency presence punch through into your realm, stabilize in a room, run a dream, ride a mood, or impersonate a lover. Harvest windows include sleep, stress dreams, lust dreams, proximity vampirism, and the astral lover who gives a chemical high and scoops the raw life force like honey from a tree. That is why the old advice is not prudishness. Keep the energy feeding the higher spirit. Not because a fluid is magic gold, because attention, longing, rage, grief, and sexual discharge are how a soul either coheres upward or sprays sideways into whatever is hungry at that frequency. Humanity is a school where a soul can wake up. And the other aspect is a world that behaves like an energy farm. Parasitic beings and parasitic patterns in many different ways. People, institutions, media, discarnates, your own unfinished creations. The farm does not require your belief. It requires your regular output of your own reduced spiritual energy sacrificed to it. Sit with that because sex is only one tap. Montauk's loosh economy runs on intensity that never completes. The matrix in his picture does not need you possessed every hour. It needs you producing. A fight that does not end in truth. A worry loop that does not end in action. A jealousy that does not end in either honest speech or walking away. A depression that is not only chemical weather, but a long agreement to emit no vertical will. Each of those states is a broadcast. Second-order beings do not care if the broadcast is erotic or bitter, so long as it is strong, repetitive, and cut off from God. Anger is harvestable when it becomes a home. Not the clean flash that protects a child or names a lie, then ends. The other kind, resentment chewed for years, rage at people who are not even in the room, the pleasure of being wronged. That heat never becomes justice. It becomes atmosphere. Things can live in atmosphere. Jealousy is almost purpose-built. It combines longing, comparison, humiliation, and replay. You picture the other scene again and again. You feed an image. The image feeds back. In occult language, that is how a thought form gets fat. In ordinary language, it is how a person gets smaller while feeling more intense. Anxiety is a high-frequency leak. The body stays armed. Attention never rests in the present. No decision is allowed to close. That is unfulfillment as a lifestyle. Monroe already said, unfulfillment held at intensity distills loosh. Chronic anxiety is that formula running in the background while you call it personality. Depression looks like the opposite of energy, and that is why people miss it. Low affect can still be a harvest if what is being taken is the will to live toward meaning. A flattened soul produces less joy, less creation, less prayer, and more of the heavy, stagnant charge that clings to rooms. Not every depression is a demon, but a long despair that isolates you and convinces you that nothing higher is real is extremely convenient for anything that feeds on the absence of spirit. Then there is the quieter food, and it may be the most common. Longing. Not desire that moves toward a real good. Longing that is kept unfinished on purpose. Unrequited love replayed until it is a shrine. The person who will not speak, will not leave, will not build, and will not offer the feeling to God. Disconnection dressed up as depth. The ache of almost belonging. Monroe's garden even used the split into halves, the search for the other, as a production method. Reaching for union and never arriving is a furnace. If the heat is consecrated, it can grow a soul. If it is chewed in private for years, it is luxury product, intense, renewable, and unused by a higher center. Disconnection itself is a crop, not being seen, scrolling past faces, living among people while remaining unjoined. The nervous system keeps sending out a call for contact. Nothing answers at the level of being. That unanswered call is still energy. A culture of isolation is not spiritually neutral. It is a field of open microphones plugged into etheric feeding tubes. So the farm is not a sex farm only. It is an emotion farm that happens to love sex because sex is loud. The same collectors will take your 3 a.m. jealousy, your Sunday dread, your quiet conviction that you will never be met. People focus on lust because it is obvious. The rest of the menu is how ordinary lives get eaten without anyone mentioning a demon. Now look at sex through that same lens. It belongs here. It is not the whole pantry. Sacred sex in these systems is a closed vessel. Two poles contained by vow, love, or a living third presence circulate the charge, refine it, and offer it up. Detached sex is the same fire with the lid off. Luxury food for demons. When I say a third term, I do not mean a legal footnote. In an ordinary contract, there are two parties. I give, you give. A third term is what the agreement is for, or who stands over it, so it is not just appetite trading with appetite. In a sacred bond, that third term can be God, a coming child, a household, a vow spoken before witnesses, a shared fate that neither person gets to rewrite when the mood changes. Without that, you only have two hungers meeting. Two hungers can exchange. They cannot complete a work. They cannot keep a lid on that much fire. That is why casual pairing leaks. There is no altar, there is no child of the act except residue. Orgasm is one of the strongest involuntary emissions a human makes. If the inner state is tenderness and dedication, the burst is said to rise and feed the pair's higher life. If the inner state is use, numbness, money, a porn script, conquest, or get it over with, the burst matches a lower band: survival, dominance, appetite without communion. That is restaurant lighting for second-order beings. You pay in two currencies at once: physical release and the emotional aftertaste. Hookup culture and prostitution often pair climax with contempt, loneliness, performance, or the ache of being interchangeable. That pairing is, in loosh terms, refined. Sex that almost looks like union and then collapses into, quote, "we are strangers," unquote, is a small factory of the same distillate as unrequited love. Contact without arrival. Then there is the leftover, the haunting. Paracelsus and later occultists described spilled, compulsive, fantasy-driven discharge coagulating into parasitic forms that demand repetition. You can read that as literal astral creatures, you can read it as self-reinforcing thought forms. The structure is the same as a jealousy image or a depression loop. An unfinished creation that lives on the act that made it. Rooms that feel sticky, apps that feel haunted, desire that no longer feels like yours, anger that arrives before the reason. That is stored emotional energy that never returned to a higher center. There is also invitation. Fantasy is not private in this cosmology. It is an address. Brooding is an address. Replaying the insult is an address. Transactional sex is a contract with no third term. Afterward, the field thins: sleep, collapse, drunkenness, the numb ride home, the rumination before dawn. Those are classic harvest windows. You do not have to summon anything by name. You only have to be open, repetitive, and slightly ashamed. This is why detached sex feels degenerate even when the arguments for it are boxed as freedom. It is not only that a body is rented, it is that the work is sold in fragments. One person is used as a still without being a spouse of the work. The other discharges the prima materia into a marketplace. No vessel, no vow, no child, no God, just heat, money, and a residue. The residue has to go somewhere. In the farm model, somewhere is already staffed. You can feel the wider version in the culture without a single occult word. Endless novelty, porn as industrial dissolve, dating as inventory, news as rage delivery, platforms that profit from anxiety and comparison, people touching and remain unjoined, a loneliness that gets louder after the act, not quieter, outrage that never becomes courage. That is not only psychology. In Montauk's terms, it is an economy. Intensity is extracted, integration is delayed. The product ships, the soul does not. Alchemy already had the picture. The prima materia is raw life, including seed, longing, anger, grief. Solve is dissolution, melting, surrender, the little death, the breaking of pride. Coagula is recombination into a higher body. A child, a sanctified bond, a character, an interior stone. The Athenor is the sealed furnace. Marriage, in the sacred sense, is that furnace. Heat allowed, lid on, time given, impurities cooked off. A life can be a furnace too. Prayer is a furnace. Honest work is a furnace. Feeling heartbreak and not turning it into a shrine or a weapon is a furnace. The question is never whether you will have heat. The question is whether anything is allowed to cook. Conjunctio is not simply human mating. It is opposites actually joining so that a third thing appears, the child of the work. Sometimes a child of flesh. Sometimes the subtle body a loyal pair grows between them over years. Sometimes a human being whose longing finally belongs to God instead of to a loop. Detached sex is solved without coagula. So is rage without justice. So is longing without offering. You dissolve the stone and pour it on the ground. Nothing is born except steam and larva. You opened the flask at the wrong hour and the spirit fled. Prostitution, in that symbolism, is the sale of mercury. The volatile spirit never fixes into gold. Porn is the same operation industrialized. Infinite dissolve. Zero wedding. Mass production of hungry images. The images then farm attention, which is loosh by another name. The feed of comparison and envy is the same operation in a different room. Family marriage, when it is real and not just paperwork, is the opposite operation. Two polarities enter one vessel. Sexual fire is allowed, even cultivated. The charge is not the property of a market, an audience, or an entity. Conception, if it happens, is the visible coagula. Even without a child, years of fidelity circulate the same heat through work, speech. Even without a child, years of fidelity circulate the same heat through work, speech, forgiveness, boredom, and shared fate. Jealousy gets spoken instead of worshipped. Anger has a person to reach. Longing has a home. That is essence refined towards spirit. That is sulfur and mercury given time to become a stone. Honor is not etiquette. Honor is hermetic hygiene. You do not pass the mystery through 1,000 unclean flasks or 1,000 unclean moods and then wonder why the gold never appears and the lab smells like a pit. A brief word on conservation, because it belongs here and should not take over. In Taoist language, essence can be spent or returned. In alchemical language, the vessel must hold. A man who cannot contain a charge will spray it into the cheapest circuit available. A body, a screen, a fight, a sulk. Learning not to leak compulsively is useful. Quitting the supernormal tap of porn is useful. Learning not to live inside jealousy and dread is the same art in another key. That is spiritual hygiene. It is not a personality. It is not a brand. If restraint becomes another compulsion, another scoreboard, another way to feel superior while remaining ungenerous, you have only changed the flavor of the farm. The point is not a count of days. The point is that the fire has somewhere human and vertical to go. Why is the leak terrible in this cosmology, not merely sad? Because it is not private. A life lived on detached sex trains the field onto the lust void frequency, where things feed. A life lived on rehearsed anger trains the field onto the bitterness frequency. A life lived on unrequited fantasy trains it onto the ache that never arrives. In the flyer stories, something eats the glow of awareness and leaves a foreign mind in its place. Cynicism, compulsion, the sense that nothing is holy. In incubus lore, a companion attaches and engineers repeats. In Gnostic language, a counterfeit spirit thickens until a person cannot tell their own desire from the hunger wearing it. The same thickening happens with a grievance that has become your identity. The haunting in the culture is the collective version. Billions of open flasks, media stroking lust, rage, and panic for profit. People carrying unfinished charge that sticks to the next body, the next argument, the next night of no sleep. Parasitism does not have to look like a monster. It can look like a habit, a platform, a transaction, a thought form you built yourself and now serve. And still, it is a school. The same heat that feeds a parasite can feed a soul if it is contained and offered. Heartbreak can become prayer. Anger can become a boundary. Anxiety can become attention. Longing can become the engine of a real vow instead of a private religion of absence. That is why the serious traditions do not all say never feel, never touch. They say do not spend the mystery without a throne for it. Monk, faithful marriage, a true consecrated pairing, honest grief before God, those are thrones. The street, the brothel, the infinite scroll, and the shrine to someone who will never choose you are not. Spiritual virtues make sense here without sentimentality. Fidelity is a closed circuit. Temperance is refusing to emit on command. Reverence is treating another person as an end, not a tap. Courage is feeling longing without discharging it into a stranger, a screen, or a fantasy marriage that will never be asked for. Patience is letting jealousy die without a feast. Hope is refusing depression, the last word on whether spirit is real. Love is not a mood. Love is the only frequency that is expensive for a second-order being to eat and nourishing for the higher spirit to receive. Montauk's practical point is almost blunt. If you do not want parasites hanging around siphoning negative loosh, stop producing it. That does not mean become numb. It means stop generating false emotion on purpose. Stop arranging your inner life as a melodrama of use, emptiness, grievance, and almost love. Stop feeding the band they can metabolize. Keep the surplus for the axis: heart, conscience, craft, a household, a vow that actually costs you. The higher spirit lives on coherent life force, love that knows its object, will that keeps a word, sexual fire that was not allowed to dictate the meaning of the act, pain that was not allowed to become a career. When that current stays in the vessel, the farm gets less of you. The school gets more. You can get sex, you can get money, you can even get a sophisticated despair that looks like intelligence. That is not the same as a fruitful life. Fruitful means something is born that is not only you. Children, a marriage that holds, a character that can stand in the open, work that outlives the appetite that funded it, a longing that finally built a world instead of feeding a collector. The isolated genius is not the pattern to copy. A rare mind can pour an undivided life into making, and the work may justify the solitude. Most men are not that mind, and pretending to be is how you stay unbound while calling it destiny. What actually holds the fire for most of us is ordinary totality: a name given, a vow kept, a household tended, children who exist because you stayed. That full offering is the lid. A private intensity with no one to receive it cannot seal the vessel. The farm wants fragments, the work wants a vessel. If there is a dark economy moving through human intensity, then detached sex is one of its cheapest shoots. So is cultivated resentment. So is unfinished love that refuses either union or release. Marriage, as alchemy rather than paperwork, is the attempt to take the farm's favorite crop, the split halves reaching for each other, and complete the work instead of paying the collectors. That is the choice underneath the culture: feed what cannot create, or keep the fire long enough for it to become a world.